Good morning. My name is Fabrizio Carmigiani, and I would like to welcome you to this policy roundtable on Australian debt. The idea for this policy panel came from a very simple observation. And whether you like it or not, fiscal policy is really hot in the policy debate. It's actually been hot, if you think about it, for several years now. Since 2008, we've seen everything. We have seen fiscal stimulus packages that would have made Lord Keynes proud, or maybe not. We have seen austerity. We have seen debt accumulation, and now we are witnessing possible default and bankruptcy. And while we all think about Greece these days, when we mention debt, we should also remember that debt is playing a critical role in Australian economic policy debate. Electoral campaigns have centered around the issue of debt, and debt is very much discussed in the media. So I probably don't need to remind you about the framework also. There will be time to discuss about the framework and the background of Australian debt. I just wrote down a couple of numbers as a reference last night. According to the latest IMF World Economic Outlook data, general government gross debt in Australia has gone up from 10% in 2007 to 38% estimated today, and it's expected to grow about 40% over the next couple of years. And similarly, the general government balance is today around minus 3% in deficit and expected to remain below, around 2% deficit in the next couple of years. So we are witnessing a situation that someone would describe problematic. And this raises a number of questions. I mean, are we really accumulating too much debt? Or is this debt sustainable? Are we on a sustainable path or not? And also, what is the macroeconomic impact of this debt? What has been the effect of debt, and what will be the effect of debt? So in order to address these related questions, we have put together a panel of distinguished experts that I really thank very much for being here with us today. And I will introduce each of them briefly. Most of you already know them very well. We have Robert Carling, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Independent Studies. And prior to joining the Center for Independent Study, Robert was an executive director, economic and fiscal, at the New South Wales Treasury. He has also held positions at Commonwealth Treasury, World Bank, and International Monetary Fund. Then next we have Warwick McKibbon. Warwick has a chair in public policy in the Australian National University Centre for Applied Macroeconomic Analysis in the Crawford School of Public Policy. He is also an ANU Public Policy Fellow, a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, a Distinguished Fellow of the Asia Pacific Policy Society, and a non-resident Fellow at the Brookings Institutions in Washington, D.C., and he served for a decade in the board of the RBA. And then we have Bob Gregory, a professor of economics at the Research School of Social Sciences in ANU. He was also a member of the RBA board, a member of the Committee on Employment Opportunities, a member of the Board of Management of the Australian Institute of Family Studies. He's also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and he has held positions at various universities in Europe and North America as well. So we have really a panel of very distinguished experts. The way in which we are going to run the discussion is relatively standard. I will now invite each of our panelists to make an opening statement. I will tell you when you are at the 10 minutes mark. We agreed to have an initial statement of between 10 to 15 minutes. And after the statement, of course, we will open up for questions from the floor. So once again, thank you very much for being here, and I really look forward to a very engaging discussion. Thank you. Robert? So we agreed on an order, and Robert is the first one to speak. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Fabrizio, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me to speak on this topic. I will just try to set this up for my presentation.
We're not leaving, brother.
If somebody could... just get it onto the full screen.
Ah, sure.
Yeah. So, look, the conventional view is that Australia's public debt is low by international standards. The Commonwealth's AAA rating is not in question, although some states have lost their AAA ratings. And therefore, there is no debt problem. End of story. But I don't think that's right. There's more to it than that. This is the graph that many of you would have seen, that is the foundation for this complacent view, with Australia, the red bar, well to the left-hand side there, hardly shows up, and in comparison with Japan and Greece and the pigs over on the right-hand side. So while I agree that the current level of public debt can readily be serviced at current interest rates and in current economic circumstances, I think that's a very narrow view, and we need to look at broader measures. We need to look at how we've come to this position. We need to look at the trajectory ahead, and we have to practice risk management in the public sector balance sheet. So the popular approach, this shows different measures of public debt. The popular approach focuses on the smallest one, the Commonwealth General Government net debt. But there are other measures. I think you've got to bring the states into the picture, which is the orange, leads to the orange bar. So that's the total general government sector. And then you've got the broader non-financial public sector, which includes the government trading enterprises whose debts are guaranteed by general government, mostly at the state level. And then you have gross debt, the middle set of bars. I think that whilst the financial assets are relevant, I don't think they can be given equal weight, because there are questions about the liquidity and availability of those financial assets, particularly in a crisis situation. And most of what I will be talking about will be gross debt, and certainly the international comparisons should be done on a gross debt basis, because there are major questions about the financial assets of some other governments. So our general government gross debt is over 30% of GDP. These are 2014 figures. They would be a bit higher now. And non-financial public sector, it's 40%. And then this does not include the unfunded public sector superannuation liability, which is in the set of bars at the right-hand side. That's net financial liabilities, which are higher again. So, I should also say that whilst all of this is in terms of debt as a percentage of GDP, I don't think that's the best measure. I'm using it because it's the convention and the data are readily available, but I think it's more meaningful to look at debt as a percentage of government revenue. And for Australia, those, of course, for all countries, those figures are higher, but for Australia, they're higher to a greater extent because our government revenue is a lower percentage of GDP than other countries. But I'm going to follow the convention and use percentage of GDP. I also think that you can't just look at public debt in isolation. You have to look at the total debt picture in the economy. This is a bit hard to read. It's taken from a recent McKinsey paper, which was making the point that there hasn't really been deleveraging since the financial crisis. Countries are still up-leveraging, and Australia, when you look at this total debt picture, is about in the middle there in terms of both the level of debt to GDP ratio and the up-leveraging since 2007. So whilst we may be low in public sector terms, we're not low in overall debt terms, and this has to be taken into account in thinking about what is the appropriate level of public sector debt, because the higher the debt is in the private sector, the higher the risk of financial crises, and as experience has shown here and overseas, one way or another, when there is a crisis of private debt, it tends to find its way onto the public sector balance sheet. So that's one of the very good reasons for having a low level of public sector debt, is so that the public sector balance sheet is strong enough to absorb the impact of an overall debt crisis. I would also make the point that every country's circumstances are unique. When we're making these international comparisons, we can't draw too much comfort from observing that there are countries such as the United States and Japan that seem to be getting away with very high levels of public debt. You've got to consider that the US has the reserve currency status. Japan, it's largely domestically held debt, and they have a high saving ratio. So every country has its own circumstances, and I think that arguably Australia needs a bigger margin of safety in debt levels because of the volatility of our main exports and the high degree of dependence on capital inflow, particularly for the banking system. Now, turning back to public debt, we've talked about the level. Now, what about the rate of increase? This shows the blue line is the increase in Australia's gross debt to GDP ratio, percentage points of GDP from 07 to 14, and what is projected to 2020 by the IMF, for what it's worth. So you can see over that whole period, our debt ratio has actually increased as much as the advanced country average, although we didn't increase as much in the financial crisis. We are continuing to increase in the projection period, whereas the advanced country average comes down a bit as they are doing more to contain the growth of their debt. So we're up by about 30 odd percentage points of GDP over that 13-year period. And that is total general government debt, including the states. And we've done that, of course, without a domestic financial crisis and bailouts, which have been one of the factors pushing up the advanced country average so much between 2007 and 2014. We've done it for other reasons. This is just an illustration of how rapidly a public debt burden can increase when things go badly pear-shaped. In Ireland, from 2007, within a few years, they had a gross debt to GDP ratio of 20-something%, less than we have now. Within a few years, it was over 100%. And this shows the increase in that ratio, percentage points of GDP, for various groupings of countries. The so-called PIGS, they went up by about 70 percentage points of GDP. Japan, 63. The US and UK, which were at the epicentre of the North Atlantic financial crisis, and France and Italy, which are just serial fiscal offenders, up by about 40 percentage points. The other advanced countries, only 16, Australia 25. So we only look good by comparison with the pigs, Japan, and the US and UK, France and Italy. All these other countries, including Germany, Canada, the Scandinavian countries, Eastern Europe, Asian advanced countries, have a much smaller increase in gross debt. And also, a policy towards debt today has to be mindful of the very long-term projections. This is taken from the latest intergenerational report. And if you look at the middle line, that is, or at that time, currently legislated policies. And over this very long period, the projection was for Commonwealth general government net debt to rise to a bit over 60% of GDP. When you add in states, that could easily be 70 or 80% of GDP. And the intergenerational report was partly a sales job for the fiscal measures that were stalled in the Senate. And the bottom line shows what would happen if all of those policies were adopted. So I think the time to anticipate these long-term problems is now, with slow-acting public policy reforms. Now, people say, well, a rule to guide the level of public debt should be that the recurrent budget should be balanced and the capital budget you can borrow for. I don't accept that. It has relevance in the public trading enterprise sector. I don't think it has as much relevance in the general government sector, where a lot of the capital expenditure is social infrastructure, which does not earn a direct or even indirect rate of return. It's things like everything from prisons to police stations to school buildings and so on. So I think a lot of that is really in the nature of recurrent expenditure. And finally, and I would also point out that that's not how our public debt level of today has come about anyway. We've achieved it not only by financing capital expenditure through debt, but also a recurrent deficit. And finally, well, what is the policy conclusion from all of this? Well, I say we do have a public debt problem, not because of the current level of debt, but because of how it has come about, particularly through the exaggerated fiscal stimulus of some years ago, and also because of where we're going. I think there will always be a non-zero level of general government debt, and indeed that is desirable for capital market reasons. But we should always strive to minimise it, subject to the economic conditions of the time. And that is not what Australian governments have been doing since 2008. And debt has increased and is still increasing by more than the economic conditions justify. Fiscal policy should not acquiesce in the growth of debt simply because the current level is low. There has to be a better reason than that. The conditions that would justify ongoing deficits are not present, and policy should pursue structural fiscal balance with greater urgency than is being pursued at the moment. And I'm not convinced that there are Keynesian reasons to go slow or even to increase the rate of borrowing, as some advocate. Having said that, I don't see any justification for an early return to surpluses solely to reduce the level of debt. The economic conditions are not right for surpluses. We're not in the 2003 to 2008 period. Quite different circumstances now. And I would just conclude by saying that I think we need some kind of a set of fiscal rules. The Charter of Budget Honesty is too vague about these things. It just talks about a prudent level of public debt. We need a more explicit rule. I think I would like to see if something like the Swiss debt break rule could be adapted to Australia. The Swiss debt break rule has been quite successful. The Swiss debt to GDP ratio continued to fall during the financial crisis. The Swiss rule really, it doesn't put a limit on debt directly. It attempts to control it through controlling the rate of growth in government spending and having deficits and surpluses at the right times. And I think that's the way to do it, not to try to specify a particular public debt level as being a cap. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next one to speak, Warwick.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio, and thank you to the Economic Society for inviting me to present in this panel. My presentation is actually going to sort of parallel Robert's. I obviously shouldn't have put my things up on the internet. They're very similar presentations. I do think a global context, though, is worth doing, and Robert's given this, and let me just reinforce this. This is a graph of global debt to GDP across all countries of the world. The gold line means not that they came first, it's just that they got the highest. That's the G7. Average debt to GDP ratio by 2012 is over 120% of GDP. If you go down the list, you can see that it's really a problem globally. If there is a debt problem, it's a problem of the advanced economies. Economists suggest 60% debt to GDP is sustainable. That's really an illusion because, as I'll talk about shortly, it really does matter what the debt is used for. But if you take that 60% benchmark, you can see that there are large chunks of the advanced economies seem to have a debt problem. Now, the good news, though, is that this is not a global phenomenon, and the emerging countries in the developing world have much lower debt to GDP ratios than the advanced economies. That's actually a good news story. That means that if there is a rebalancing, you do have the capacity for some parts of the world to be adjusting in a positive direction while other parts of the world might be recalibrating. Now, Robert showed this graph, but I'm breaking it up in a different way. This is the OECD Economic Outlook from May, and I've taken each country's debt by 2016, so there's a small amount of forecast in there. The total length of each bar is the debt in 2016. If you look at the composition, the blue line is what the debt was in 2007, so that's before the financial crisis. The red line is the amount of debt that's accumulated during the financial crisis, and the green line is the amount of debt that's been accumulated post the North Atlantic financial crisis. Now, you can see Australia is, as Robert pointed out, except the graph's backwards, so I'm moving from left to right, whereas he moved from right to left. No politics involved whatsoever. But Australia here, when I first started drawing these graphs a few years ago, Australia was right down the end on the right, and Australia's been moving back to the left, and you can see this is gross government, this is state, federal, local in gross, and this is the same data that Robert used. About 39.3% debt to GDP ratio forecast by 2016 under policies before the current budget was announced. And New Zealand's been moving in the opposite direction, so we've passed each other now. New Zealand's heading towards the low end of this chart, Australia's moving towards the high. One thing you'll notice, and again, Robert pointed out, take a country like Ireland, very low debt to GDP ratio. Ireland's about 7 or 8 along. Very low debt to GDP ratio before the financial crisis. This shows you how you can very quickly move from a stable, sustainable position to an unsustainable position remarkably quickly. And Robert made this point, and I'll reinforce that point. Ireland's not the only example of that. Iceland is another example of that. And again, this is where private debt becomes public debt. And that, I think, is a big question. So you can see, relatively, Australia seems to be doing well. But the key point here is that the relative size of debt across countries, that's actually not the relevant comparison at all. The reason is, it matters it matters what the nature of the servicing costs are relative to the uncertainty in the available income streams. So a country that's very open to commodity price fluctuations, whose revenue base depends on this highly volatile global commodity prices, has a totally different set of issues than a country whose revenue base is based on domestic consumption tax revenue base. And so the source of revenue, the uncertainty in the revenue, it's not just the mean, it's also the standard deviation, matters a lot in terms of managing the risk of a particular debt situation. It also matters what the debt is used for. So if you've got debt that's generating a very large income stream, then it's actually self-financing. As long as the rate of return on the debt is equal to or exceeds the rate of return, the rate of return on the asset that's being created with the debt exceeds the rate of return or the cost of the debt, it's a perfectly sustainable situation and there's no issue. People say, well, okay, maybe you're bounded at zero. Actually, you're not bounded at zero. There are some government programs which actually generate a significant negative rate of return. And a very good example, which if you look at what happened during the Australian crisis, some of the programs that we invested in, like insulation, actually, when the data is looked at, and there's this great paper that's just come out of Chicago, Berkeley and MIT, which is really causing a real big problem in the US, these guys did a randomised experiment on 30,000 houses in Michigan. And they found that the rate of return on insulation in houses was minus 9.5% per year. So it wasn't just that it was a waste of time insulating the house, and this is taking into account climate change benefits and everything. The fact is the rate of return to this activity is much, much different to what you might expect. And this is actually turning a lot of debate in the US on its head because people believe in the McKinsey cost curve, which is designed by engineers. This was a randomised experiment where they actually put insulation into houses and they watched how people responded, they measured how people responded, and the behavioural response, the rebound effect if you like, turned out to having such a big impact that it completely changed the calculations. So government programs that may appear to be great from an engineering point of view could turn out to have negative rates of return. So that's even a bigger problem than a zero rate of return, because not only do you have to cover the expenses, you have to then cover the additional costs over time. So going forward, and Robert's touched on some of the issues I would have touched upon, but I think it's very important to make a difference between what is actually capital expenditure, which generates a rate of return which is measurable, and that is infrastructure spending, and what is current expenditure. And so we need a sound process if you are going to have the government providing infrastructure spending, which I think they should, even though it's complex in Australia because the federal government finances it, but the state government implements it. I still think you need a very sound process to do that sort of investment and take it out of the political evaluation. I would argue, in fact, what we should be doing, given the state of the global economy and the level of world interest rates, that we should be issuing 50-year debt, we should be borrowing at almost zero, and we should be investing it in large-scale infrastructure programs in a way which was nation-building. Now, how you do that from a practical point of view, from an apolitical point of view, I understand is a real serious set of debates and issues, but I still think that it's something that we need to consider because this is a one-off opportunity. Australia is in a pretty good position. And again, foreigners are looking for yield. And the classic example was the East-West link in Victoria. The funding costs of that project were incredibly low. The capacity to get the project done at very low cost by bringing in European tunnellers and European builders was incredibly cheap, and we have a government that just throws it all away. And if you ever have to go back to the market to redo that, the costs are going to be at least 50% higher, I would argue. I think there's actually a more important question. Again, Robert touched on that. It's not does Australia have currently a government debt problem, it's does Australia have a private debt problem? To me, that is the interesting question. If you look at some data, and again, I originally pulled out the Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank always has the cost of servicing household debt in the chart pack. But when you look at how they construct it, it's a quite distorted sort of picture. This has actually been reconstructed by JCP Investment Partners. I'm on their advisory board. And this shows you that if you look at, this is the debt service ratio for households. So it's household interest payments relative to household cash disposable income. And if you look at this chart, you might say, well, there was this big spike up to 2007, and that was when interest rates were rising. But now it looks okay because the debt servicing has come right down. And the reason for that is because of interest rates have fallen. If you look at the actual debt, this is household credit relative to household disposable income. You could understand why this would rise from the early 80s through to the 2000s because Australia's growth prospects expanded enormously, and it made sense for households to borrow, to build up, to bring consumption forward in anticipation of being a lot wealthier. But from 2011, the downturn in the global economy from 2009 plus the shift in commodity prices, you'd expect that the optimal level of household debt would be a lot lower than it is today. So this chart should have turned, and it did start to turn around 2010, but then it's gone back up again. And it's gone back up again to a situation which you could argue is very, very risky from a national point of view, because interest rates are low, but if they ever change and go back up again, this is a debt to income ratio which was going to be very problematic for people. So I would argue in the end that we don't have a government debt problem in this country. We have a political deficit. And the political deficit is that both sides of politics refuse to understand the nature of the economic problems that Australia faces, and equal blame can be handed to both sides of politics. There needs to be a national consensus on where there is some way forward. We need to bring back the size of government. We need to change the way the tax system distorts private behaviour. We need to have these reviews that have been announced, but I'm not very optimistic that we'll actually get anywhere with the current state of politics in this country.
Thank you very much, Mike. And now, Bob?
Somebody put my thing,
Yeah, sure.
some student.
Yeah, sure, no worries. I can do it.
Well, I'm always impressed at my good judgment. I figured I could go third because I talk about something different. It's worked out really well. And I thought if I went third, the other two speakers had set up the stage really well. And they've done that. So let me just summarise quickly more or less what they've said, which is basically if you just stand where we are now and you don't look forward, we don't have the debt problem. End of story. The second point, which is much more interesting though, is that you're not that interested in stocks per se. You want to know how things are likely to evolve. You want to know what's going to happen to the debt. Is it going to become a problem or not? And to do that, you've got to look not at the debt per se, but what's generating the debt. And how you're going to claw the debt back, and you want to claw it back. In other words, you've got to look at the government expenditure and revenue. And that's where this title comes from. If you look at the projections, they really are fairy tales for a whole bunch of reasons. And this is the picture I want to talk about. I just want to talk about this picture for my allotted time. And if you all get the picture quickly and understand it quickly, I don't even need to continue. This is taken from the Treasury and Grattan Institute. Well, the Grattan took it from the Treasury. Grattan, by the way, I want to say something about quickly. What a good job they are doing, by the way, of putting stuff on the table so we can all look at it. So this basically is government revenue, which is orange, and expenditure, which is the other colour, and the difference is the deficit, and debt or not. And you can see by 2019 these lines converge, and we're basically in surplus. So when you look at those lines, one of the things that strikes you straight away is what brings about the surplus? What brings about the surplus is that our Prime Minister, who says the taxes will either not be changed or reduced, who says that taxes will be cut for companies, that we won't tax on super, is basically clawing back the deficit by increasing taxes. This is a very big tax increase. You see the orange line? Very, very big increase. What, from what? Taxes from, say, 20.5% of GDP to 25%. Now, not only is this a big tax increase, but the question that you should ask yourself is, where is the tax increase projected to come from? And the answer is 70% of it is individuals. So the government policy as revealed by what's expecting is that we've solved the deficit problem by basically agreeing to increasing personal income tax by 7%. Now, the Prime Minister, of course, hasn't said that recently, nor is Joe Hockey. I mean, what they've talked about essentially is cutting taxes, cutting company taxes, not having GST increases. So this is where the fairy tale comes in, right? I mean, I don't see how the Prime Minister or the Treasurer can actually bring this about. It just seems to be completely indifferent what they stand for and what they've announced. Therefore, the game's not over. And in some sense, the game hasn't started. So the question then is, if you can't do this, you know, if the political process forces you into tax concessions, tax cuts, then, you know, the deficit continues. And so the debt rises. Not that it's going to be 5% rise, so there's a lot more to come. The second thing I want to say is, notice that what happens to the expenditure line. I mean, you get the impression that we've done a lot to cut expenditure. But basically, the expenditure line is sort of not going to move at all. If you look forward, you've got the so that's still on the table. So all the reforms and the welfare agenda and all that sort of stuff which have been going on are all huffing and puffing with respect to the average total. In other words, something in this process is replacing the sort of cuts that we've managed to achieve. Now, the interesting story there is that we've all been conditioned to believe that it's the ageing issue that's generating this. But if you look over the next decade, it's not aging at all. There is an item which is going to add 1 percentage point to GDP to expenditure. 1 percentage point, by the way, is a very big number. Never gets discussed, this item. And that item is the National Disability Fund. It's going to add 1 percentage point. So if you think about that, then I think two things come immediately to mind. Either the scheme cannot go in its current form, in which case that's going to lead to all sorts of political movement and shifting, or the cuts have got to be bigger somewhere else, given what I've said about it. So my major point then is I don't think that this is feasible, this policy. That's why I call it a fairy tale, and therefore I think the whole question of the government deficit really is not on the table yet. So I'm really echoing essentially what Warwick said. We do have a serious political deficit, and I think if you're going to discuss topics like this, you've got to move out of the classroom and get into the politics to make the discussion interesting. And I can't see, this is where I get a bit tricky, how that deficit is going to be resolved. You know, I just think the current leadership on both sides and views about what leadership should do is not conducive to still sorting this out. Take something simple. Suppose I was Prime Minister and I was going to have a tax review. And somebody said to me, what are you going to do about superannuation? I wouldn't say nothing. What are you going to do about company tax? I'm going to cut it. I wouldn't say anything like this. I would sort of say, you know, I'd try and set up the tax problem and let the review do it, but we just don't do that. So I think that our biggest problem is that this is not going to occur because it's not only politically not possible, but I just don't see how the process is going to come to grips with it. That's one of the things I'm worried about. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is that people like me, who make their life out of lines, I really do tend to believe that if you take a line that's straight and push it forward, that it's sort of has a life of its own. You know, I sort of believe in these lines. And I just want to stress to you, I think, because our profession doesn't do this well enough, of how these lines are in fact going forward very mythical. Right? They are fairy tales. That is, our ability to project these lines about what actually happens is very, very weak. Now, we sort of know that, but one of the nice things the Treasury has done recently is this sort of thing. Which I must say, I hope my stats is such that I don't really understand this picture. But this is the cash balance 2014-15 is roughly where we are. The line is where we, is the projection. Just look at the error band around this line. Going ahead 1 year, there's a 1 in 3 chance that the deficit will be a surplus between 0 and 1, or a deficit between 3.5 and 5. I mean, that's an enormous rate. So, in other words, not only do I think that the forecasts are politically not on, I just think that statistically they're sort of not on. And that essentially sort of, I mean, I don't believe the Irish story is like in Australia, but the Irish story is the same sort of idea, about how hard it is to predict these things. And then the last thing I want to say, or not the last, the second last, I guess, is that not only is there a large error in what we do, but everybody, even our institutions, are like creatures of habit. Like Bob's always optimistic, Bob's always pessimistic, or Fred's always miserable, or James always happy. The same thing can extend into the forecasting process. That is, that the forecasting, when you stand where you are and forecast ahead, and you work out the predictions and the errors you do with the next period, these are not random events. They're not completely independent. People carry forward their misjudgments. And you can see here quite clearly that the Treasury has consistently been unable to get the forecast right. Partly because the world is changing, and partly because you always lag on the change. The old lag-dependent variable approach is really good approximate. So the fact is that not only do we have large error bands, but they're serially correlated. So in other words, if you're starting off in a situation where you forecast and you get a deficit that's bigger than you expect, the odds are it's going to be bigger than you expected. That is all the forecasting is serially correlated. And the last thing I ought to say, which is I'm a little disappointed in, let me go, I'll forget all about that, is the following. It's not the slide. I want you to think about, if you can't forecast 1 year ahead, why would you want to use forecasts of 20 years ahead? I mean, I think Robert put up a picture, or Warwick, about the deficit, about what's going to happen, the debt, and you see in the next 3 years nothing happens, but in 20 years' time, it's like this. Now, obviously that's stupid. Well, no, it is obviously stupid. And you're led down that track initially by thinking about demography, where you can do a little better further ahead. But hanging numbers off those demography projections, very, very tricky. Now, 25 years ahead is stupid. Anybody who thinks 25 years ahead is not stupid can leave, right? Well, so why don't we do the following? I'm going to move it back. Is 20 years stupid? Is 15 years stupid? 10? 5? How about 2 years stupid? And the reason I say that is the following. Once you forecast out to 2 years, all those pictures then from then on are projections built in basically assuming past growth rates. So in 2 years' time, all the projections are based on 2, 3, 4, 5, roughly 3%, 3.5% growth rates. Because that's what we used to have. So when you look at these numbers, you've got to realise that the quality of the 1 year ahead, 2 year ahead is not only different in terms of the distance of statistical, but different in terms of the changing technology. Now, those pictures I started off with are based on, see we can go backwards, yes we can, I think. Is this backwards? No, this is backwards. This picture is based on essentially after 2 years ahead, returning to 3% growth rates, returning to sort of golden period. And it's that bracket creep of that period that's dragging up the income tax. And I don't think that's very good. My own view is that when I look to 2 years ahead, I just become more and more convinced that the chance that China will go worse than we expect goes up, The mining boom on the investment side is running down. So I think on average, 2.5 year out, 2 year out, but more to this. So to get back to the key point, there's no debt problem now. It'd be nice to do a bit of adjusting on the debt problem. But the debt problem per se is not interesting. What's interesting is what you're going to do underneath, right? How you spend the money, how you raise the money. And that problem, I think, is going to continue. And it's worse than these things we get. Because these stories are just not believable. That's my thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you for these very interesting opening statements. So now we have our panel, and I just would like to, I'm sure that there will be plenty of questions, and we've got quite a bit of time to take as many questions as possible. So the floor is open. I've got a question up there.
Thank you. My question was related to the graph paper which has recently been released around Treasury's forecasting activities and how they're sort of using overly positive expectations in setting budget forecasts. And also the way that Treasury's now started to use, I guess, creative accounting in how they present forecasts in terms of budgets to make their budgets look like they're moving back to surplus. Do you have any comments or thoughts about these recent practices?
Would like to take this one?
The point of my story is not to blame the Treasury under any circumstances. I think we're well served by the Treasury in terms of getting as much stuff out there as they can. My major point is it's the nature of the process in the institutions. And as a part of that, we do sort of fall into not understanding exactly what's going on. Because, if you're the Secretary of the Treasury, the last thing you want to get up and say, guess what, my projections next year, I've told the Prime Minister my projections next year are 30% chances, blah, blah, blah. So the process doesn't work. It just leads to this. And what our job is, and by ours I mean those people outside the economic political process, our job is to make sure that we don't fall into the traps that are a necessary part of the system. But you can hardly expect Tony Abbott to get up and say, he's got up and he said that we've done the hard work and the deficit is solved. You hardly expect him to get up and say, and the way I did that is I'm endorsing bracketry. It's our job to say that's effectively what he's saying. And that's basically my message.
Yeah, so again, I reinforce what Bob said. I don't blame Treasury for this whatsoever. Treasury's doing a good job. I disagree with Bob in the sense that I think you do need to do some form of projections with transparent assumptions, fully acknowledging the uncertainty, just so you've got some sort of benchmark on which to think about different scenarios about the future. If you just blindly think the future's going to look like the present, or if you just blindly bring in a management consultant who's going to give you some rosy story that's not based on transparent numbers, then you're in a serious problem from a policy point of view. And I think it's a bigger issue in the issue of climate change, when you have to think out 20 or 30 years, even though realistically you can never predict that far ahead. You do need something to tie down the framework for doing the scenario planning and the potential bending of curves and things. But generally I think this is a real problem. I think the idea that we use the trend growth rate methodology, because we've always done that, I just don't think that's a good methodology. And I think Treasury probably agrees with that. Convention is something that's hard to change, but I think that needs to be changed. I think the fan charts are a great innovation. I think the probabilistic, the ranges around them is probably wrong. I don't quite know where they got those numbers wrong, but yeah, the uncertainty is probably even larger than that.
I'll just take the opportunity to have a shot at forward estimates. I think 4-year forward estimates were a wonderful innovation whenever they were introduced back in the 1980s, I think, but they are being misused. They're being presented as if governments, and this happens at the state level as well as the Commonwealth level, they are presented as if they are a 4-year budget plan, essentially. But they're not. They're simply meant to show the consequences over 4 years of existing policy, and everyone knows that existing policy will change. Invariably, in recent years, you've had the forward estimates where we're in deficit now, but gee, by the 4th year, we'll have a balanced budget or a surplus. And this happens at the state level, it happens at the Commonwealth level. And we should be paying much more attention to the budget year and maybe the year after that, and less attention to the 4th year.
Next question. Yes. The microphone is coming from this way.
I'm Raja Janaka from UNSW. I'd like to make 2 separate points. First, I think governments have debts, but governments have assets as well. And I think our government data doesn't actually show you explicitly how much is investment, how much is consumption expenditures. Expenditures in education are considered to investment, not consumption. So that's one point. Second point is about private debt and household debt, which Warwick mentioned. I think households do borrow, and for a short while we found that they had negative, they're consuming more than they income for many years, but then suddenly it changed around a couple of years ago. Household debt is very important because corporations will not survive if households couldn't borrow in terms of mortgages, in terms of hire purchase, and whatever. So unless Warwick would like to suggest that we're going to tell banks not to lend to households because that debt is quite bad, we're going to have serious issues there.
So in no way am I suggesting that a household shouldn't borrow. What I was saying was, if you look at the profile of debt over the last 20 to 30 years, the level of debt right now induces a severe vulnerability into the economy, which the fiscal accounts will have to pick up if there is a problem. And Robert made this point that once you get to a vulnerable level of household debt to GDP, don't stop them borrowing. Let them borrow, but make sure that there's somebody in the system, i.e. the government, who'll be there so that when they do have to come in and solve this problem, if it turns out it's supposed to be a problem, you have the capacity to do that. It's all about risk management. It's nothing to do with stopping people from doing what consenting adults may want to do. In fact, it may well be that we are borrowing insufficient today, and that early on we were borrowing even more insufficiently than we should have been. We should have known the China boom was going to come. We should have spent like crazy in the 1970s. We should have brought all that consumption forward. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty, and I think just to be aware that there are vulnerabilities both in terms of the household situation, but also in terms of our vulnerability of our income streams from our tax payments from our future income streams, which are highly volatile. We are a commodity currency. We should not be having the debt to GDP levels the same as other major economies that have a very different revenue stream than we do. And that's, to me, risk management.
When I was started to think about this topic, somebody said to me, well, what is the debt used for? Like how much of, basically your point, how much of it is investment and how much of it is current expenditure. And then I thought about that a little bit, and then I didn't know the answer. Partly the accounting process itself is not clear. I mean, you can't just pick up and say, guess what? We've got a deficit of 3% of GDP, but we've got a deficit, we're spending 10% on capital expenditure and clawing back the difference and so on. The accounting's not good. But secondly, which is also, and that's easy fixed. But secondly, the hard thing is what is investment by the government sector? Because one of the things that's happened over the last few decades is the expenditure on welfare, education and health has become a very, very large proportion of what the government does. And in terms of government expenditure growth, the education now basically is being pushed onto the private sector, so that both parties have sort of agreed to that, although the other parties would say so, but basically agreed to that. The health they're in the process of pushing on. The welfare is we're pushing on as well, but they're slowing up because of the age problem. But when you think about those things, the health, education and welfare, they can be thought of as investments. But the question is, are they really, you know? And how do you work out the rate of return? And I don't know the answer to that. We don't give that much attention. That's why that paper you're quoting sounds to be like a really interesting paper. It would be nice to try and go through, you know, expenditure on health, education, and try and work out rough rates of return on parts of those activities and see whether we can do that better. We don't do that at all
Well, Australia follows the government finance statistics international standard, basically, in classifying things as capital expenditure or whatever. As a result of that, defence equipment is now classified as capital expenditure. For many years it was consumption, and I think that's more what it is. But I don't think we should get too hung up about these classifications. What are the policy implications anyway? If you could call the whole education budget, including teacher salaries, investment, the whole health budget investment. What is the policy implication that it's okay to go out and borrow to cover the whole education and health budget? I don't think so. And I think you can find out from the accounts. The ABS has this wonderful publication called Government Finance Statistics, which enables you to see exactly what is classified as operating expenditure in the language of today of accrual accounting, operating expenditure and gross fixed capital expenditure and so on. But as I say, if you classified too many things as capital expenditure, it would be a recipe for fiscal laxity, I can tell you. We can already see nowadays politicians call just about everything they spend is an investment, and it's not really. They like to do that because it sounds good.
Thank you. I had a question over there, and then
Good day, Mark McKibbon from QUT here.
okay, I can't.
The financial products underlying the whole thing don't seem to get much attention. Can I suggest there are major flaws? We've got market failure in finance, and we're trying to compensate by economic strategies. So my question is, do you know of any work being done in this area? And if so, how can we also in Australia take this forward with someone like the Reserve Bank taking an actual look at the financial market and its economic implications? I think we've got a major asymmetry in creditor-debtor relationships, for example, which leads to all sorts of problems down the line. So, question, thank you.
It's not on there. I'll just use the microphone to say, look, that's just, I take the question, but I don't know the answer. I think that APRA, ASIC, RBA, there's a bunch of regulators out there who are looking at a whole range of these sets of issues. I do know that things are different since Lehman's went down in terms of the way the Reserve Bank thinks than before. That was a total and absolute surprise to us on the Reserve Bank board and also the staff, what was happening. We knew there were problems, we knew there were likely to be implications of the housing market bubble bursting. We had no idea of what the financial linkages were going to be and how that was going to propagate through the economy. So things are changing. I think Bank of England have done a lot of great work on this. They're probably at the head of the analysis, I would argue, but there's a lot of work going on in Australia and in the US. So things are now different to what they were pre-Lehman's, but I still think there's a lot of things out there that we don't know.
Thank you very much. I have a question there.
The US has been an interesting case study over the last few years, getting the budget deficit down from double digits. I think it peaked probably around 12 or 13%, back to around 3% in a handful of years. Obviously, key contributors have been getting people back to work, getting companies generating profits and paying taxes. Are there lessons there for Australia around what we could do on the budget simply by getting the economy moving, by reinvigorating the business sector and the labour market?
Look, if the economy gets moving, everything's fine. If we get, I mean, and by that I mean not only real GDP growth, but somewhat heretically, even if the prices start going up a little bit faster, things start looking up, right? In the sense that you start following more practically and so on. So if the economy's moving, it's fine. The real question is whether governments can do things to help quickly. Now, one of the things that seems to me fairly straightforward in economics is we sort of know what governments can do to make things worse in the long run. But how to make things better quickly, I think is a really tricky game. And I don't know about that. I mean, I'm still in the view, I'm still in the old Keynesian school, which basically says, you know, if you have a major crisis like a year, government should spend more. So I'm still in that school. But, you know, at this particular moment, what our government could do to give us 3% growth in 2 years' time, I don't really know the answer to that. And I don't think, people sometimes pretend to know the answer, but I don't know whether people do. You know the answer why?
So the US experience, I mean, I do actually. The US experience is largely driven off the back of the energy boom. And the fact is that there was a massive bring forward of investment about 2 to 3 years ago as a result of fracking and horizontal drilling, which really brought down the cost of imports and led to an increase in the demand for energy-intensive outputs. And so that investment boom, by our modelling, suggests that would add to about 1% of GDP per year over the last 3 years, just from the investment component, and then the input cost is about 0.25% of GDP. So that was fortuitous. The US has been lucky in that sense, but secondly, their economy is reasonably flexible, and they were able to recover. The unemployment rate fell remarkably quickly, actually, from the point of view of other economies, compare it to Europe.
But not the employment rate.
But not, well, the unemployment rate though. But there's a question about the participation rates and the demographics that are in there, and the Fed have been analysing this to death to try and work out how much of this is demographic, how much is permanent, how much is temporary. But I think the big issue for Australia is, you know, we could rely on an energy boom like that, but you've got to deal with local politics and gas extraction, and the issue in Australia is very different to the US. But the big issue for us is we can do a lot just by looking at where our taxes are most distorting. You know, it makes perfect sense to move our balance away from income taxes towards consumption taxes. You could really address most of our issues by broadening the GST and raising it by a couple of percent, and giving income tax cuts and giving corporate tax cuts. When we're not in a situation that's unfixable, you've just got to have the courage to actually get rid of the distortions that are in the system and compensate. I understand the Labor Party problem with the fact that, you know, GST will hit low-income earners. Compensate them through the transfer system. Don't go through every single policy and say, is that policy fair or not fair? Because if you do that in the tax system, you have the worst tax system in the world, because you can't do you've got to do the efficiency, in my view, first, and then you do the equity afterwards, because otherwise you end up with every policy being fifth best. So I think we can do a lot by getting to the key issues that Bob raised about superannuation, about tax reform. Yeah, that doesn't take much to get those wedges to stop being fantasy to actually being closed.
I'm sort of on the side of increasing GST, but one thing you've got to remember, and you probably, maybe you don't know this, but roughly speaking, half our tax revenue comes from income tax, roughly speaking. 1/4 from company tax, roughly speaking, and 1/4 from GST. Now, the 1/4 from GST, that's really quite important, right? Because that means that if you move a percentage point in GST, you're moving a percentage point of 1/4 of the revenue. So you can't buy a lot, Warwick, for 1 or 2 or 3 percentage points on the GST. Now, if you want to buy a lot from the GST, given that we've got this revenue problem, you've got to talk about a bigger increase. For example, you can't replace company tax with a GST of 20%. It's just not big enough, for example. So I think that's one of the things that I sort of wasn't fully aware of myself, is how the GST is not as big as we think it is. So then that raises the question about whether you want to make it bigger, not only by increasing the level, but trying to broaden it. Right? Because some of the inefficiencies you're talking about come from the fact that the GST doesn't cover everything. Well, you're not talking about replacing income tax with a consumption tax, you're talking about replacing income tax with half a consumption tax in some sense, right? A tax on half of it, which itself has distortions. So I think you've got to do the numbers on the GST, and it's not quite big enough as I would have liked it to be. So.
Just to comment quickly on the US situation, well, unquestionably, an economic growth environment is the best one for curbing budget deficits and getting debt burdens under control, and they've had a reasonable measure of economic growth there. In addition, they have, in recent years, they've actually done a reasonable job of controlling the growth of spending in a terribly messy way and using blunt instruments, but they have actually controlled their spending in the last couple of years. We shouldn't forget that their stock market has trebled since March 09, more than trebled, and income tax revenue in the state, in federal income tax revenue, and in some of the states, income tax revenue is quite sensitive to the stock market because of capital gains tax revenue. So all of these things have worked in their favour. But maybe it's just a temporary reprieve. Right? Bob doesn't like to look more than a couple of years ahead. But
You said that too.
But the CBO puts out these reports quite often showing the impact of demographics on Medicare costs and Social Security costs, and they're really going to ramp up in a few years' time to a much greater extent, and you know the deficit problem then just comes back.
Thank you very much. I have a question here and then there. Sorry, no, did you ask? No, okay, my mistake. And then, of course, there is someone from up there. Please raise your hand.
Toby Chen from Goldsmiths, University of London. I kind of like look to the UK to see what could be done in Australia, because obviously in the UK there was quite a big collapse in kind of revenues from the banking sector, and in the Australian story it's kind of the mining sector. Australia's in a unique position where it at the moment has kind of some underlying problems, but it could go a different direction, and I kind of fear that kind of austerity in Australia might become ingrained, and we're seeing, you know, that policy of harsh austerity actually still doesn't resolve the debt. So I'm really interested in this idea of actually looking at, say, you know, 50-year bonds, particularly when you've got low interest rates, and they kind of pension funds themselves are in a big problem, particularly when you've got really low interest rates and their return is not returning what they should do. So I kind of do see there's a really good case to make for these longer term bonds at good rates, at favourable rates, so that it kind of pleases everyone.
Yeah, so I mean, again, I would bundle it though. You can't just say, well, let's solve the problem by issuing 50-year bonds. What you need to do is focus on what you're spending on, what you're taxing. So the composition of the fiscal position is just as important as the size of the deficit. And just like Bob mentioned, if you don't get much revenue switching from an income tax to a consumption tax, but if you look at the Henry Review, and John Freeburn has written a lot about this, the efficiency loss per unit of revenue of the different taxes are really quite large. So the consumption tax is right at the bottom of efficiency loss. So even if you don't get much revenue, you do get the longer term economic benefits which accumulate. So improving the tax system is a good idea. I would Bruce Chapmanify the budget. I would take everything I can and turn it into a contingent loan, income contingent loan, whether it's drought relief, whether it's parental leave, a whole range of things, and Bruce is sitting over there at the moment. I would actually think that's sort of taking what's currently all the risk borne by the government and all the payments borne by the government, turning it into income contingent loans so that the government provides what the private sector can't. It fixes the market failure, it enables people to smooth their income over the life cycle, but it actually takes a lot of the risks, the longer term risks off the government accounts. So clever reform combined with an assessment that we can borrow this money offshore and all the capital losses will be borne by foreigners if interest rates ever change and if the exchange rate ever collapses. That's a good strategy as a bundle, but I wouldn't just go down the road of issuing the debt without going through the reform process, because again, you're just postponing the disaster by doing that.
Well, I think you used the austerity word in your question. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean,
are you saying there is austerity in Australia?
Well, to be honest, austerity in the UK, the debt is actually doubled. So it is actually a policy that actually doesn't particularly work in terms of dealing with the debt problem. So, can there be... I think the public infrastructure, if the private sector aren't going to be taking up that slack, that there is a good case to do that.
Well, I think austerity is an unfortunate... I know it's widely used. I think it's an unfortunate pejorative term. I don't think the UK had any choice but to apply what I would call fiscal consolidation rather than austerity. And many countries which ended up with very high debt levels after the global financial crisis really had no choice. And I don't think that over time it increases the level, the debt burden. I think over time it works.
It's actually in the UK, the debt has gone from 750 billion to 1.5 trillion. Fair enough, the deficit itself is kind of getting under control, but the debt itself has doubled.
Well, as I say, you need economic growth to deal with that. And they are getting pretty good economic growth now in the UK. They're enjoying quite a good recovery. And I think the fiscal numbers will improve. If that is sustained, the fiscal numbers may improve more rapidly than is currently expected.
It's the revenue that in income that they're not getting that increase in kind of the revenue that they're getting is actually it's decreasing. Often it is not achieving what they were expected to achieve.
To pick up one of Warwick's points, I'm not in the school of thought which believes that the way forward is to move the risk off government onto individuals. I just don't think, in general, that's the right way we should be looking at things. Now, I'm in favour of some of that, of course, and but I don't think that's what governments are supposed to do. I mean, I thought governments had special advantages as an insurance agency. I thought they had special advantages as redistributing. Right? This idea, for example, to make it a third tax, the idea that we should move the risk of unemployment expenditures when people from government to the unemployed, for example, which is the extreme case, is not what I'm in favour of. To move the risk of bad health from the government to the individual is not what I'm really in favour of. So, well, you might play around with that a little bit. I don't see that as a big part of, agenda. I would not like to see that as a big part of the agenda moving forward when we think about government debt.
Okay. I have a question up there. Right.
Thanks very much for the talks today. I see Ben Stevens was up here a little while ago last month and talking about Sydney house prices. And it appears at some level that a lot of governments rely on pumping up house prices to get people to borrow against that to increase consumption. Everyone's happy. Do you foresee that there could be some housing bubbles coming up around Australia that could damage us in the long term by using this method? Are they using that method?
Yeah, well, I think that state governments are far too dependent on stamp duty revenue. It's as simple as that. And you can look at the fortunes of the New South Wales budget and see that they correlate perfectly with Sydney real estate, mainly housing, but real estate more generally, booms and slumps. You can see that at least as far back as the late 1980s. And they moan about it in the bad times and enjoy it in the good times. And I think that it would be good all round to reduce that dependence and move away from the stamp duty on real estate transactions and towards a more of a property tax on the value of property.
One of the things I want to make 2 points. One of the things I didn't say about expenditure holding, some of the expenditure holding has been achieved by trying to push things onto the states. So if you go to the budget, there's a big portion of health expenditure and education expenditure back on the states, which seems to me to be unsustainable. So that's going to unwind, basically, I think, no matter what happens. And secondly, one of the reasons the squeaking hasn't started that much is because of this point that some of the states are doing okay about house prices. And that won't last. If you think about risk, the states are also, even though the states don't take export revenue per se, they are very risky on this aspect. On the bubble thing, the trouble with the bubble is that clearly we're one instrument short. You need, if you're going to do monetary policy, it seems to me you need sort of two instruments. One to pick off these asset groups. And that's pretty obvious in the textbook, for example. But then when you think about what the second instrument will be and how you would work that, that's when the banks run into trouble. They run into trouble on capital gains taxes, and the government runs into trouble on that. They run into trouble on all those sort of taxes. So the house bubble today problem was the sort of 1988, 89 stock market problem. So these asset problems just keep popping up. And one instrument short, and I don't think we're that much further along putting in an instrument that would work or would be thought to work.
So I have a particular view of how monetary policy works, right? Monetary policy really doesn't create productivity, it doesn't create things. What it does is it moves spending either from the future to the present or from overseas to the domestic. So it either works through shifting it temporally or through bringing down the exchange rate, which means you temporarily get an export gain, and that's where stimulus comes from. Using monetary policy to actually drive asset bubbles, and whether it's US monetary policy driving up the US stock market, whether it's European QE or Japanese QQE, those sorts of policies are really, really last resort dangerous policies. And what they are bridging mechanisms. That is, there has to be somebody from the government, fiscal accounts, has to come in behind with serious structural reform, fiscal reform, something which helps you come out the other end. So when the bubble is about to be identified and burst, it's no longer a bubble because the real economy has actually given true valuation to those assets. That's the way I see this working. Now, if you're pushing a system to get the bubble and you don't come in behind with the real activity that's going to justify the prices, those prices will drop, and they will drop in a very destructive way. And we see that with the US housing market in 2006-07, from the policies of 2001 when the dot-com bubble burst and the Fed got in there and held interest rates too low for too long. So these policies, I understand why central banks do them, and the alternative is no good. But if the policymakers, either structural reform or fiscal reform or some other reform, doesn't come in behind, you end up where we are in Europe with Greece, you end up where we are going to be in Australia. You can justify at zero or low interest rates housing prices in Australia. That's not the question. The question is when interest rates then go back to some relationship to a long-term marginal product of capital, what's the true value of the house? And that's why I think the real part of this has to be dealt with, and we're not doing it in this country. And actually there's very few countries where you actually see this happening. And central banks will be damaged by this, because if we get enough of these problems of bubbles bursting, whether it's the Chinese stock market or a whole range of these asset markets, it makes central banking look like a pretty poorly administered policy process, and then the politicians want to take it over again, and then we're in deep trouble.
Got a question up there?
Hi, Bully Kardak from La Trobe University. I got two questions. One of them is, I'm not sure I understand perfectly well, but there was talk of wanting to reduce government deficit or government debt, public debt I should say, to create space in the balance sheet to bail.
Sorry, can you speak closer to the mic because we can't hear?
Sure. So there's wanting to make room in the public budget, public debt, so that you can bail out companies or individuals when things go wrong. And I'm just wondering, like, the idea is maybe to push cost onto the private sector, drive debt onto private individuals. There's moral hazard there, right? And then you set yourself up to sort of, as a government, to recover the people. I'm just wondering what your thoughts about the moral hazard of that. And the second thing I just wanted to emphasise, I think thinking about, I like the way Bob was thinking about things, and I think all of you are thinking about this as well, but it's, the micro is kind of missing here. The aggregates, they make good headlines, but ultimately you want to ask the question, why are we spending this money? And is it giving us something as an economy, whether it's solving market failures, solving equity issues, or investing? And ultimately that's the question you need to be asking. And if the society values what we're getting from the debt, then we need a plan to work it, and these ideas of 50-year bonds might be a way to do that. But that's the question, rather than just sort of saying, well, look at this trajectory. I don't know, I guess there's a sustainability issue, but I think the micro is really important as well, rather than just looking at the aggregates.
On the first point, I don't see it as a matter of making fiscal space for bailouts so much. I think what I meant was that if there is a balance sheet problem in the private sector and it leads to a balance sheet recession, then indirectly it finds its way into the public sector just through the operation of the automatic stabilisers and the way the fiscal revenue and expenditure responds in those circumstances. You tend to get an expansion of public sector deficits at the time of a balance sheet recession in the private sector, and any bailouts would just be on top of that, but I don't see that as being the key issue.
Yeah, just reinforce what I said, and I agree with you. Why do we tax? What do we tax? Why do we spend? Are we spending on the things which we really want to spend on? What's the utility function for society? Those sorts of issues are exactly right, and I don't think any of us here would disagree with that.
Thank you very much. I think that we have come to the end of our session. Before we thank our panelists, I would like to remind you that if you're attending the business lunch, please, you should make now your way towards the location of the lunch. But now, please join me in thanking once again our three panelists.